Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from The Smart Stitcher. This tutorial introduces you to creating a glove with different colour panels. So we take you through how to work with the pattern block that you've taken for your hand, how to then start to break it up, add in different panels and create some different design ideas, and also a little bit on how to stitch some of the panels together to make things a little bit more decorative and a little bit different. So let's get into it. Now for the glove that I've just shown you, we want to start off with a good clear outline of your trank. Now I have got this on tracing paper and I'm going to sort of be working on top of it, but I've got several sheets of tracing paper ready to use. So I've got my basic outline and I know that these are the measurements that fit my hand, and then I'm ready to sort of dive in and start thinking about what I'm going to do and how I'm going to break my panels down. Now I would always recommend starting with some sketches. These can be really loose, really rough, but they're just to kind of get your brain thinking, get your mind whirring about the kind of idea that you might like, whether or not you want something that is symmetrical, whether you want to go sort of asymmetric. I think I must have been thinking about Valentine's Day when I was thinking about these shapes, and then eventually just through a few sketches you start to sort of hit on some design ideas that you like and that you wish to then sort of develop. So once I've got kind of an idea about where I'm heading, I'm then going to start working it up on a more of a full-size version. For the style of glove that I'm talking about, I quite like the idea of having separate front and back panels. So as you can see, my back panel here, I've got sort of the black for the fingers, I've got two slightly curved panels that come down across the hand, and then I've also got that red central panel running sort of through the middle, slightly off to the left hand side. If I flip over to the palm view, you can see that I've again separated the panels, and I've also then separated my thumb piece as well and sort of added a seam in there. So this is how the method I'm going to show you today, but there are also a few things that we need to consider when we start to break down our gloving pattern. The first thing to think about is making sure that you've got your sizing correct. The key thing with any glove is that you want to be able to get it off and on the hand without anything ripping or busting open with time. So the first thing is to always check and do a mock-up in your original sort of leather to check that your pattern actually fits before you start breaking it down. Very important. Sounds incredibly obvious, but sometimes it's easy to dive right in and not then start to think about the impact of the design on your hand. So the first thing, always check your measurements to make sure you get your gloves that fits. The next thing is that wherever you start to break the pattern down, you are removing some of the stretch as you are sort of thinking about joining your panels together. So as I am sort of putting this one on, I'm aware that the stitching has in effect reduced some of the stretch, so I've still got to make sure that I can get my hand on and off without anything sort of busting open. This glove, I don't sort of do particularly tight fitting gloves personally. I tend to like a little bit of ease so I can move my hand without things getting stuck. So you have to make sure and sort of bear in mind that wherever you are adding a seam, we are going to be adding on a seam allowance, but we're also remembering that this does sort of restrict some of the stretch as well. The third thing to think about is wherever we're cutting, we're then going to need to add on an extra bit of leather for stitching. This isn't going to be very much leather, but in effect we would need to add like a mini seam allowance, if you can imagine that. So on this particular glove, I've cut open the seam that goes straight down the hand, which is in effect this one here, which is normally not cut. This is normally on the fold, so I would then need to make sure that I add in a seam allowance there. On the right hand side of the glove, that's already kind of factored in, so we've got a seam allowance there. So it's just wherever I'm cutting where it wouldn't normally be cut, I need to make sure I add in some leather. I also need to make sure then I add a little seam allowance to all of the panel pieces so that they then sit correctly in the right place, and also I've allowed enough that I'm not going to lose any stretch, but I also have catered for any underlaps and overlaps within the pattern piece. So you can see the back of the hand here, the red is sort of sat right at the bottom with the black layered on top, and it's fairly similar on the palm view as well. So the black on top of the red. How much of a seam allowance you decide to add is going to very much depend on how far your preference really for stitching from the edge. In this example, I've added nearly 5 mils. I think probably in reality I'm much less than that, so I could probably make it maybe even 3 or 4 mils. So whatever you are happy stitching, and that's always a good example then, just to have a look at some gloves that you've done, also a practice piece of stitching, work out where you're comfortable, and then work out your seam allowance from there. It's always good to make a kind of mock-up pair if you can, because it allows you to then sort of work out these sort of fits and the seam allowance, and then you can of course add that onto your pattern. So I knew I wanted to separate the front of the hand from the back of the hand, so I've actually drawn them out on tracing paper, just tracing directly off that trank, but I've left a gap in the middle so I can add my seam allowance, which I've done just by adding a line that's then parallel to the where I would have in effect just cut. I've then gone and drawn on the panel shapes, so where I wanted to have certain areas level, and the sort of the swoop on the palm view meeting the sort of the top of the red from the back of the hand view, I've then sort of drawn a horizontal line just as a marker so that I can mark up the different sides so that I know that they'll be accurate. I've then drawn on the shape of the panels that I've wanted, and this is, you know, this is the good thing about working on tracing paper. You can experiment, you can take your time, you can sort of then just sort of see how it looks to that full size. So once I've then drawn everything on, I'm not actually going to cut this because I'm then going to be tracing the shapes off again, but this will become my master copy. Now, in order to separate the thumb panel, I've done the same thing with the thumb. So I've traced both halves, but I've left a gap in the middle, which is where I've added the seam allowance. Now the fourchettes for this particular red and black glove are a little bit different, and we have a kind of double joined fourchette with what's known as a quirk that sits at the base of the fingers. So I'll show you what those look like in just a moment. So I'm not really covering those two on this particular tutorial. We will be covering them later on. My focus is to talk to you about how to do your panels. So just to introduce you to the different style of fourchette and the quirk. So you can see here, I'm just trying to angle my hand, that I've got the fourchette, and that goes around the base of the finger, and then the diamond shaped quirk actually sits at the base of the finger in between sort of where the webbing is. It shows up a little bit easier on the red, where you can see we've got the double fourchette, so that's just cut down the middle. The quirk is inserted at the base, whereas on your different type of fourchette, which doesn't have a quirk in it, it just follows the shape of the finger. It's got a seam at the bottom, and it sort of creates that kind of V shape, which then mirrors your finger. So on the back of my hand here, I've got that sort of the base of that U shape, and then the base of the actual quirk itself, the diamond shape, is here. So I should just take my glove off to show you what that looks like. Hopefully this is a little bit easier to see. So before the fourchette gets cut, if you can imagine, it's that sort of shape that we had on the tracing paper. When it's been cut, the fourchette is separated, the quirk is inserted at the base of the finger towards the palm side, so just here, which is probably slightly tricky to see. The red one might be slightly easier to see against the black, so you can kind of get a sense of how that sits at the base there. And I find them quite useful if you've got sort of somebody that's got deep hands, maybe larger fingers. They are decorative as well, but it's quite handy, and it's just a nice little design feature to be able to add it in to help just get a more comfortable fit. So that is a very quick tour of your fourchette, which has a quirk inserted at the base. By starting to draw in some of the effects where things are going to be stitched and where panels are going to be joined and overlaid and underlaid, I can start to work out where I want my underlaps to go, and sort of just adding them out helps to serve as a little bit of a reminder, so that I'm not just tracing and forgetting the seam allowance. I'll be tracing and adding the seam allowance. So if I show you an example for the red section on this glove, I can see that it underlaps by both the black on the left and the black on the right, and also the black that goes over the fingers. So I know that when I've traced this particular pattern piece, I will need to leave my seam allowance, because the leather has to go underneath and then overlap within that seam allowance. So it will also serve to then just as a little bit of a guide to help me work that out. So the next thing to do is to lay my tracing paper on and to start tracing my pattern pieces. So let me just show you, zoom out a little bit to show you what that's going to look like. So I know for my side piece here that I don't actually need to add anything to that other than just making sure that the lines are nice and straight. So I can then just start to trace off that individual shape. Now once I've finished tracing that one, I don't need to add any seam allowance to that, but I can just give it a label so I know where it's going to be going. I'm then going to remove the tracing paper along, or move it along a little bit, so that I can then, I've got a little bit of a seam allowance there, so I can then come back now and I can draw in the shape of my red panel. Now I find it helpful to draw in the complete shape, and then I can add the seam allowance afterwards. So I'm going to just start off by making sure that I've got the shape in the right position. And again, if you notice that you go wobbly anywhere on any of your lines, then take a moment to make sure once you finish tracing that you're happy with everything being nice and smooth before you add your seam allowances and anything else on. So my outline here, I can see that I've got the red ready for its seam allowance. So I can see here that the seam allowance has already been added, and I'm now going to add on my 5mm, which I think I've allowed for this particular pattern, onto my red panel here, and that's going to look a little bit, I shall draw it on and show you, but it will look a little bit like I've just made everything wider, but I'll show you what that looks like. So I've added a few numbers because I think that'll probably be helpful for me to show you what's happening as I'm going along. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So each panel has its own number. I've started tracing the second panel, and that doesn't need any seam allowance because the red panel that's underneath it will have that seam allowance and it'll underlap. So I've drawn around number 2. I've then shifted the tracing paper and allowed a little bit of a gap between 2 and 3, and I've then drawn on the actual size of the panel, and then I've added on my ½ centimetre seam allowance. And you can add your ½ centimetre by using dividers, you can mark it with a ruler. If you're going to eyeball it, just make sure that you're really accurate. And again, once you've drawn on, make sure that you're happy with your lines. So I'm just going to work my way through, and I'm then going to just draw on the other panels, noting where they need to underlap and where they need to overlap, and then we're ready to get these stuck onto card. When you're designing, it can be really easy and great fun to sort of start to maybe think about dividing up the fingers. I've deliberately stayed away from that in this tutorial because there is a lot that already happens with the fingers when you look at your fourchettes, when you look at sort of where things are inserted and added. So I've kind of deliberately stayed away from that, and I've just gone on to that side seam. But of course, wherever you choose to divide up your pattern, just sort of factor in where you are working as well, and make sure that you can easily divide the pattern up but still attach the rest of the glove together too. Now I've got everything cut out, I've added my seam allowances on, and I can see roughly now by laying the pattern pieces on top of one another how everything is starting to look. Now I've just laid them on just to sort of check for fit, but also to try and just add a few reference points to make sure that as I start to construct the glove, I know that I need to line pieces up accurately. So I'm using my tracing to place the card templates on, trying to just get everything nicely lined up, and then I'm going to sort of add a few markers once I'm happy that I've got everything lined up. And this is where it can help just to have some weights and things, but just by lining the seam up. Now I know that when I'm stitching, my obvious start point's where two things line up, but sometimes it can be quite useful just to pop some markers in to make sure that I am matching up what I need to match up, particularly on a curve where things might be vulnerable to stretching. So I've added a few markers just to the pattern pieces whilst they're kind of lined up and all in position, and then that's going to help me bring and sort of sew everything together. So I just make sure that they go across both pieces, and that'll be then really helpful for sewing our glove together. Now you will notice that there are some double arrows on this. So when we lay out and when we cut our pieces out of leather like we've done before, the stretch is still going across the hand, even though we're limiting it a little bit by stitching. So when you're cutting out, the rules apply that the stretch of the leather has to go across the hand, and that just makes life getting easier to get the glove on and off. So always check, and this is certainly something by the time you've got sort of finer pattern pieces, say like this one, you want to make sure that you are very, very accurate when you are cutting out, and that you are not angling it or just trying to turn it to get the best out of the leather. Working with the stretch, as we've done before, is really, really important. So you want it to stretch across the hand, and that's really, really important, particularly in areas where you're opening up a seam and removing some of that stretch. Now before I started sewing, I just wanted to have a quick kind of test to work out whether or not what I was doing was right, and also just to sort of check the pattern pieces and check the look and feel of the glove. Now this particular material is just using an interfacing. It doesn't have any give in it, and perhaps it's one of the arguments maybe for not using it as much as using it, but I just wanted to have a look, and I can see from an earlier experiment that it doesn't have enough give for me to get my hand in, but it does enable me to see the effects of the panels that I've created. The next glove that I had a quick go at was making, again similar with the design, but I'd made it a little bit wider and in fabric like the calico this one is, so you can see how I'm sort of just having a go with things to work out the design. Sometimes it's quite useful to do that, particularly if you just want to check something out. Otherwise you end up kind of potentially wasting your leather, which you don't want to get expensive with that. So as far as possible, it's always a good idea if you've got spare leather to make a mock-up in your glove before you commit to that final piece. But it's also quite useful to use other materials as well if you just want to sort of test an idea and get a sense of what that looks like. So on this particular style of glove, I've used a combination of backstitch, which is what you can see on the backs of the panels here, and on the fourchettes, and for the major sort of construction seams I've used the pre-stitch or stab stitch, which is sort of been fairly familiar on gloves in a lot of my tutorials. Now if you have a look at how the back stitch kind of works, I think it's quite nice when you do have a split panel to be able to show the back stitch, because it just looks really nice on the inside. So this is the inside of the glove, and you can see where the seams have overlapped or underlapped, and then just how nice it is to have that sort of back stitch kind of coming down. This is the palm view, and I haven't pushed the glove out, but you can sort of see from the inside we've got the sort of the black which comes up and over the fingers, we've got the red which kind of dovetails in quite nicely, and you can see just how close those seams are. So we don't need a massive seam allowance, but we still want enough to be able to secure our glove and to make sure that our seams are nice and discreet. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of an inside look on the inside of the glove there. So once you've got the basic techniques and you've worked out where your panels will sit, and you know where you've got to add on extra to cover an underlap or an overlap, you can then apply those sort of principles used in creating this kind of glove to other types of gloves. So if I wanted to keep my trank whole without splitting or cutting it, then I've got another design idea here where I have just worked across the trank. I have avoided the fingers again, just because I don't necessarily want to get caught up with some sort of tricky areas around the fourchettes. That's probably for future tutorials. So for this one, I've sort of kept the fingers whole, and I've kept to sort of just some really nice kind of wavy creative lines across the trank. And again, the same principles of what we've just done would apply. So wherever I've decided I want the leather to sit over, I would need to make sure that the panel underneath had was extended to accommodate the seam allowance, and I add that on. Key thing is to take that moment to work out where you want your underlaps and your overlaps to sit, and then of course add on your seam allowances. So on this particular side, I was quite undecided as to whether or not the red was on top or the black was on top, and in the end I went for the black. So that meant when I was tracing my pattern pieces and adding the seam allowances, I knew that for piece number 5, which is my red panel, I had to make sure that I then added on that seam allowance to make sure that I was then going to be able to sew it on and have that nice kind of underlap with enough to then sew the leather together without losing any of the size. So happy stitching everyone, and enjoy breaking up your patterns and just experimenting with your glove designs. Who knows what you could come up with? The possibilities are endless.